Hi, I'm glad you're here. As I tell you this story, I'll be quietly crocheting. There's no rush here, just slow hands, soft movements, and a story about a woman who reached a moment many of us know. When Margaret Turner turned 58, nothing special happened. No celebration, no one asking what she wanted. This is a story about what happens when life becomes quiet and what it means to finally choose yourself without drama, without permission. When Margaret Turner turned 58, nothing special happened. No dinner reservation, no small gathering, no one asking what she wanted to do. The day passed quietly in Toledo, Ohio, the way most days had for a long time. She woke up at 6, before the alarm, the way she always did. Old habits were stubborn like that. She made coffee in the drip machine that clicked and hissed before finally settling into its familiar rhythm. Fed the cat, stood by the kitchen window, and watched the neighbor's porch light turn off across the street. It was late October. The trees were nearly bare now, and the leaves that remained had turned brown and brittle, stuck to the sidewalk like they had given up trying to move on. Margaret wrapped her hands around her mug and thought, "So this is it. This is my life now." She didn't think it with drama. She thought it the way one thinks about the weather, just honestly. For 32 years, Margaret had been someone's wife. When people asked about her marriage, she always answered the same way. "He's not a bad man." It was true. Richard had never been cruel, never loud, never dangerous. What he was, though, was distant. He worked in logistics for most of his adult life. Long hours, early mornings, later years filled with long silences and half-finished conversations. Together they had raised 2 children, Emily and Josh, and done all the things people were supposed to do. Soccer practices, PTA meetings, college savings plans, holidays at his sister's house in Cleveland, where Margaret helped in the kitchen and smiled politely at the right moments. Margaret worked too. First part-time, then full-time once the kids were older. She took a job at a medical billing office downtown. It wasn't exciting, but it was steady, predictable, reliable. That word followed her everywhere. She's so reliable. You can always count on Margaret. No one ever said, "She's passionate," or "She's interesting." Richard moved out 3 years earlier. Not after a fight, not after an affair. At least not that Margaret ever discovered. One evening, while she stood at the sink rinsing plates, he said, "I don't think I'm happy anymore." The water was running. A plate slipped slightly in her hands. "Oh," she said. And that was it. He moved into a small apartment near Maumee Bay. They divided things quietly. The couch, the lawnmower, the photo albums which Margaret insisted he take copies of. When he left, she cried for exactly 2 weeks. After that, something else settled in. Not sadness, not relief, emptiness. The kids were grown by then. Emily lived in Madison, Wisconsin, married and pregnant with her first child. Josh lived in Austin, Texas, working in tech, calling when he remembered, texting more often than he spoke. Margaret loved them both fiercely. She just didn't want to be a burden. So she didn't say the things she felt. She didn't say how quiet the house had become. She didn't say how sometimes she forgot the sound of her own voice. She didn't say that the evenings stretched on endlessly, filled with television she wasn't really watching. Instead, she said, "I'm fine. I'm keeping busy. Don't worry about me." On her birthday, Emily called in the evening. Mom, happy birthday! Emily said, breathless. I'm so sorry I didn't call earlier. Today's been crazy. That's okay, Margaret said, and it was. What did you do today? Emily asked. Margaret paused. Work, groceries, leftover soup reheated in the microwave. Oh, nothing special, she said. Just a normal day. Well, we'll do something when I visit, Emily said. I promise. Margaret smiled at the phone. Of course. After they hung up, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed and stared at her hands. They looked older than she remembered. Thinner, the veins more visible now. When did that happen? She wondered. A week later, on a Tuesday evening, Margaret stopped by the public library after work. She didn't need anything in particular. She just liked the quiet, the smell of paper and dust, the feeling of time slowing down the moment she stepped inside. Near the bulletin board by the entrance, a flyer caught her eye. Community Education, Beginner Pottery. Wednesdays, 6 to 8 p.m. She stared at it longer than necessary. Pottery. She remembered being 21, taking an art class at Owens Community College. How much she loved working with her hands. How calm it made her feel. How she used to lose track of time completely. She hadn't touched clay in decades. Margaret almost walked away. She always almost did, but this time she reached out and tore off one of the little tabs with the phone number. Her heart beat faster, and she wasn't sure why. At home, she stood in the kitchen, coat still on, holding the flyer. You're too old for this, she told herself. Then she paused. That's ridiculous, she said out loud, surprised by the sound of her own voice. She dialed the number. A woman answered. Community Center. This is Linda. Hi, Margaret said. Her voice sounded uncertain. I'm calling about the pottery class. That's great, Linda replied. We still have a few spots. Margaret hesitated. I'm 58, she said. Is that okay? There was a brief pause. Then Linda laughed gently. The oldest student last semester was 74. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Well, she said, in that case, I'd like to sign up. The first night of class, Margaret almost didn't go. She stood in her bathroom, looking at herself in the mirror, tugging at her sweater. You don't belong here, the old voice whispered. She went anyway. The room smelled like clay and water. About 10 people sat around the tables, some couples, some alone, a mix of ages. Margaret chose a seat near the end. The instructor, Mark, spoke about patience, about imperfection. Her first bowl collapsed halfway through. She laughed, an actual laugh, when it happened. Most things don't work the first time, Mark said. Margaret drove home with clay under her fingernails and something unfamiliar in her chest. Hope. Pottery became her Wednesday night ritual. Then she joined a Saturday morning walking group along the river. Then she started cooking meals just for herself, meals she actually liked. One evening she told Emily about the pottery class. I didn't even know you liked pottery, Emily said. I forgot, Margaret replied. For a while. Richard called one Sunday afternoon. I heard you've been busy, he said. Busy enough, Margaret replied. I'm glad, he said. You deserve that. Margaret realized something then. She didn't need his approval. She never had. The biggest change wasn't the classes. It was her voice. She stopped apologizing before every sentence. She said no when she meant no. She stopped waiting for permission that was never coming. One night, walking to her car after class, Margaret thought, "This is my life, and I still get to choose." On her 59th birthday, Margaret did celebrate. Nothing extravagant. Soup, bread, wine. A few people from pottery class around her kitchen table. At one point, she looked around and thought, "I built this. Not a perfect life. Not a loud one. But a real one." Margaret's story didn't end with a grand transformation. She didn't move away. She didn't become someone else. She simply became herself again. And sometimes that's the quietest kind of freedom. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. I hope the story of this ordinary woman helps you reconnect with yourself in your own life. I'd be happy if you subscribed and continued listening to my stories here.